Today we're going to talk about safety and risk. Um, Risk analysis uh, really does go hand in hand with utilitarianism. To do a legitimate utilitarian assessment, you effectively have to do a risk analysis. Unfortunately, being that this, risk analysis is more of a business decision that's beyond the scope of this ethics class, I can't go into great detail about how to do a risk analysis, just that you have to do one. All right. Engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in objective and truthful manners, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully, so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So, the first thing we need to talk about when we say safety and risk, what is safe? So generally speaking, a thing is considered safe if the risks are judged to be acceptable. Now I go into the definition of each of those individual terms. I don't want to get too academic here, but what I want you to think about is when you're dealing with the general public, do you think they're going to do the 5 whys and ask, is something safe? Are they going to consider the real risks of whatever you're doing, whatever you're building, whatever the town wants to do? Are they going to be able to identify the risks themselves? Or they're going to be entirely dependent on you to do that for them? Are they going to identify risks reasonably? That is to say, will they make arbitrary guesses as to what's safe and unsafe and make it clear that they're very, very concerned about things they should not care about at all? And are they going to use reasonable metrics to determine if something's safe? Generally speaking, the answer is no. What's most likely is they're not even going to bother doing a risk assessment. They're just going to trust that you do it for them, and you should do it for them. That's your job. But if they don't, they're going to start arbitrarily defining what is and isn't risky. You really don't want the government doing this because they'll start making arbitrary laws. But you also don't want to force their hand into doing it by allowing bad things to happen. They're not going to consider what is and isn't safe based off of quality metrics. They're going to just determine what's safe based off of how they feel. And unfortunately, that's a very bad way to go about defining risk. So when it comes to public safety and people's behaviors, it comes in 3 flavors. The first is risk averse. I would assume that I am risk averse. I frequently overestimate what is and isn't risky. I have gotten a lot of feedback, specifically from my wife, that I am hindering progress. I tend to see potential danger in even of the simplest of tasks. And from time to time, I cause delays because of my concerns. If the delays end up being erroneous, that causes a lot of tension, which also ends up leading to a lot of frustration. And so sometimes I can be difficult to deal with if I think something's unsafe. Then there's risk tolerant. These people tend to assess their assessment about safety are not a priority. This is not the top of the list of things they're concerned about. They prefer to go with the flow. They trust that their coworkers in the company have already performed the appropriate due diligence. Occasionally puts them in situations where they fail to recognize potential risk. The last is risk appropriate. So this person will actually say out loud, has someone done the due diligence to measure the risk to see if this is safe? And if it hasn't happened, they'll go do it themselves. They consider relevant factors. They actually go find metrics that make sense and quantify them. And they evaluate the potential consequences. And once they've done that, they make informed decisions that strike a balance between caution and the pursuit of some opportunity. So we're talking about safety, now we're going to talk about risk. Risk is the potential that something unwanted or harmful may occur. Sometimes this is bodily harm, sometimes this is economic loss, it could be environmental degradation, but it's not limited to those three. This list goes on. In a utilitarian sense, it tends to always go back to economic loss, and that's not because they're money grubbers or they're overly concerned about how much things cost, but it's because it's easy to quantify. And so when somebody talks about bodily harm, they end up talking about the literal cost of, say, losing your arm. What's the cost to that person in terms of how much money they could have made had they had both arms over the course of the rest of their life? How much happiness are they going to lose? Can you quantify that? You know, now ask yourself, how much is your arm worth? How much would I have to pay you to cut it off such that you wouldn't be sad anymore? Probably a large number. Now, risk comes in three flavors. There's the risk that's always been there. You just became aware of it just now for some reason. The magnitude of the risk has genuinely changed for some reason. Or there's a new technique that allows you to see it. So the first one is COVID. The risk of a pandemic and a plague are really high, inappropriately high for how willing we are to tolerate it. In 2009 or so, the U.S. established a program called PREDICT. This was founded under George Bush. The project, it came into existence because pandemics, epidemics, plagues are a real threat. Just because they're happening somewhere else doesn't mean that they can't get to the U.S. Now, to keep things off of U.S. soil, there was a large effort to identify where the current pandemics and epidemics were and to keep them where they were. If there's a pandemic over in Africa, let's make sure it stays there. Let's give them the aid they need to identify who's sick and where it's moving and make sure that it doesn't get onto a plane to the U.S. And these projects were all over the world, but in September of 2019, it got canceled because I forget who was in charge around that time, but he said that that pandemics were just a scare show used to control people. And so it got canceled. It lost funding. Now, granted, it's about 6 months later they decided to refund it, but not until after COVID. There's global warming. For a lot of people, global warming didn't mean anything to them. Climate change didn't mean anything to them. I make the joke from time to time that I'm perfectly happy with climate change because it's going to make Rhode Island warm, and Rhode Island's very cold. But what we're also starting to see is that hurricanes are getting worse, they're getting bigger, they're more frequent. It's becoming a real problem. There's a real risk here that coastal towns like South Kingstown, though it won't go underwater, could easily get very damaged. There is a pond at the bottom of the hill here at URI that does go all the way out to the ocean. And if the water levels rise, even just temporarily, that can get back to my house, and that's a real risk. Next is cybersecurity. It's a good example of new techniques coming along. In the past, a lot of the cybersecurity techniques were reactive, meaning they'd have a problem and then they'd fix it. And now a lot of cybersecurity experts are saying that's really the wrong way to go about that. You should plan ahead of time. And they have a lot of new techniques to do this. They have penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, threat and intelligence platforms, advanced analytics, real-time monitoring, data analysis, and pattern recognition. I made the slide before AI was a big thing, but I'm sure in the next year or two I will be adding some AI system into that. But there's a lot of places, and this is kind of a funny story. I personally haven't worked somewhere where cybersecurity was a real problem. I worked for the Navy. They spent a lot of money making sure everything was secure. I've worked for URI. I get paid to make sure everything's secure. But I have a lot of friends who kept getting viruses on their work computer, and they weren't getting viruses because they were doing anything inappropriate. They were getting viruses because their supervisor, who was somewhere between 50 and 70, would click on every link that got emailed to them. And my friends would actually have to be, even though they weren't IT specialists, they weren't computer scientists or computer engineers, they were the ones who ended up having to implement the actual cybersecurity system because everybody there was too old to implement it themselves, and they were just too used to being reactive instead of proactive. And getting hacked and getting your data stolen, or more accurately destroyed, is a real risk that in the workforce you need to be concerned about. Now, what's acceptable risk? That's subjective. I'm not going to tell you the statistic I'm showing you right now is the thing you need to accept. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just using this number so that we have something to grasp, something we can point to that I know for the most part everyone in this room drives. And if they're willing to drive, this is the risk that they're assuming. If you drive for long enough, you will eventually die in the car. But everybody seems to be happy with this number. Now, there is some apprehension to risk. There's voluntary acceptance. If an individual is willing to choose to engage in an activity or accept a certain level of risk, they might be indifferent to the risk. Whereas if I force you to do something dangerous, your attitude's going to be very different. If my wife asked me to climb a ladder to go get something, there might be a fight because I'm afraid of heights. But if there's something up there I want, I might be more apt to just do it on my own. And there's the effect of knowledge. The level of knowledge and understanding about the probability of harm associated with a specific risk can impact how individuals perceive and apprehend it. Enhanced knowledge may lead to greater awareness and more cautious approach, while limited knowledge may result in underestimating or overlooking risks. So, this is to say, if you don't know something's risky, you're really likely to do it. Whereas if you know there's a lot of risk associated with that task, you're not going to do it. If there's some kind of external pressure, it tends to be job related, you're probably going to be more apt to do it. Sometimes this is just peer pressure, sometimes this is your boss saying you have to climb that ladder. And depending on the scenario, it might be because you're just peer pressured into it, it's part of your job, you know ahead of time there was an expectation to do it, there's financial pressures. Additionally, especially if this is like a job-related thing, you might overlook a risk because your job requires it, not because you're genuinely overlooking it, but because you have other priorities on your mind and you just forget. There's immediate noticeability. So I know that when people fly, there isn't going to be a plane crash because they're very rare, and I don't expect there to be a plane crash anytime soon. However, that is the number one thing on my mind when I'm on a plane. And that's because it's immediately noticeable. I can see the huge distance between me and the ground. And this causes me a lot of fear, which makes me apprehensive to getting on the plane. And then the last is if you can identify the victims. So internally, you have your own metric of identifying who's good and who's bad and how everybody should be taken care of and all that jazz. And so when it comes to risk, the degree of apprehension can be influenced by the ability to identify potential victims beforehand. When risks are associated with identifiable individuals or groups, there's often a heightened sense of concern or apprehension, as people can relate more personally to a potential harm. So my son really likes to play on the swing, and I don't really argue with him on that. But one day, I thought I was home alone. Well, I was home alone. And I was screwing around, and I had set up a swing for him, and it's at the top of a hill, and I would get the swing as high as I could, and then I'd jump off, and I was having a lot of fun, and I was by myself. Keep in mind, I'm a functioning adult, but this is still fun. And I'm not paying attention, and eventually my wife comes home with both of my kids, and immediately my son wants to do it. And the thing is, I was okay when I was doing it. I was accepting that risk. But now my son's seen me do it, and he wants to do it. Now, I'm sure he'd either chicken out when it was time to go, or he'd be fine if he did. But I could identify this being a problem and didn't want him to do it. Now, there are a handful of reasons to refuse risk. Um, there's lack of control. So this is when somebody is imposing risk on you. And to a certain extent, especially at work, if somebody's doing this, you probably should resist. There's perceived lack of benefit. Look, if someone's imposing some kind of risk on you or you are accepting some level of risk, there should be a reward for you. In business, this is quantifiable. If there's a risk of you losing some money, the only reason you take it is if there was a chance that you'd gain a lot of money back. If the person who's imposing the risk on you isn't trustworthy, you won't want to. Usually if somebody says, just trust me, after trying to suggest I do something risky, I know not to trust them. Um, if it comes across as unfair, that is to say, one group of people have to assume more risk than another, but the benefits aren't evenly distributed, or the benefit is evenly distributed, that becomes across as unfair. If I'm assuming more risk than you, I should get more benefit than you. And lastly, there's some emotional, psychological factors that you just can't get over. Um, I have a very strong fear of heights. I don't like climbing ladders. I don't like getting on planes. Um, and even though I know in a handful of situations I've been in, I was at zero risk, so like getting on a plane, that didn't matter. I was too scared to do it. Still didn't do it. So I'm going to quickly do a story time with you. My son is also terrified of heights, but he loves getting on planes. He likes being on planes. He likes going on trips. He also loves his mother's horse. And I'm terrified of the horse. Well, not terrified of the horse. I'm terrified of falling off the horse. Blue is very nice. And so I have seen my son get bucked off. And he's fallen a good distance relative to his own height. But he knew that he was fine and he got back up. This is an instance of him accepting the risk. He's doing some task. He knows that there's a chance of that happening. He just accepts that it might happen. But he also doesn't really process that there's a risk of him falling when he's on Blue, because he trusts her, and for good reason. The time he got bucked off, he didn't get bucked off Blue, he got bucked off another horse, but he trusts her. He trusts that she won't get upset with him, that she won't get scared, and for the most part, that's an accurate statement. But I've put him on equally tall objects relative to this horse, and he's gotten terrified. And not because he doesn't trust me, but because the thing I've put him on is scary to him, and he doesn't like it, and he doesn't see any good reason to be up there. Now, another story time about perceived fairness and lack of benefit. A friend of mine, Stephanie, she is a delivery nurse. If you live in southern Massachusetts and you are pregnant and you're going to deliver, there's a good chance you're going to be dealing with Steph. Now, one of the things that she would do is she would train people on how to be pregnant. This means you'd sit them down, you'd tell them what exercises they were allowed to do, what food they were and weren't allowed to eat, things like that. Now, this was new to me when my wife first got pregnant, but pregnant women aren't allowed to eat deli meat because there is a chance that the deli meat is bad. Now, most men, when they eat bad deli meat, are down and out for maybe a day. It's not quite food poisoning, but when women who are pregnant get this type of food poisoning, it's very common for them to have a miscarriage. So eating deli meat is strictly forbidden. And to a certain extent, this comes across as unfair. The benefit of not eating meat it's not really there, right? Not eating the deli meat there's no real benefit besides now you're more hungry and you have less things to eat. And she had one patient come in, and Steph was going through the checklist of the things you can and can't do while you're pregnant and what things in your life you have to modify. And she got to the deli meat section, and the lady said, "Oh, I've already gotten that taken care of. I know not to eat the deli meat because I might get botulism and all that jazz." And Stephanie stopped because question one was, "What drugs are you on?" And this woman's response was heroin. And so in her mind, heroin wasn't a risk, and she was willing to accept that risk because she felt she'd be losing autonomy if she gave it up. All right. Now, we need to talk about effects of knowledge. I'm going to do a case here with you just to get the point across. The level of knowledge and understanding about the probability of harm associated with a specific risk can impact how individuals perceive and apprehend it. Enhanced knowledge may lead to greater awareness and a more cautious approach, while limited knowledge may result in underestimating or overlooking risk. So, imagine that the U.S. is preparing for an outbreak of an unusual disease originating from Asia, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimate of the consequences of the program are as follows. Program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. Program B, there's a 1/3 chance that 600 people will be saved and 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. Which do you favor? If you're watching this from home, pause. And I want a written, this is what I'd choose and why. And do that before you go to the next slide. So this case was given out to 1,000 people, and they found about 72% favor option A. All right, option B, or next case. So it's the same situation. However, you have program C and D now. Program C, if it's adopted, 200 people will die. Program D is adopted, 1/3 chance that nobody will die, and 2/3 chance 600 people will die. Now, I want a written response. If you're watching from home, do you favor C or do you favor D? Pause now before you proceed. Thing here is, most people prefer D in this case. About 22% of people accept C, and then 78% say D. Now, if you're at home, I want you to go back and look at options A and B and compare them to options C and D, and I want you to describe to me how they're different. So the takeaway. Options perceived as yielding firm gains will tend to be preferred over those which gains are perceived as risky or probable. Options emphasizing firm losses will tend to be avoided in favor of those whose chances of success are perceived as probable. So options A and C weren't really all that different. Options B and D weren't really all that different. But you can see that the way it was phrased definitely made you lean one way or the other, even though they were more or less the same set of options. All right, so these are reasonable reasons to assume risk. There's an economic necessity. Sometimes in work and business, you need to assume risk to make money. And I don't mean bodily harm, I just mean there's business risk. You have to risk money to make money. There are special instances, special jobs where you get paid more for assuming risk. These are jobs like underwater welding. If you are deployed, there are more, I can't think of them at the moment. If you can perceive control, sometimes this is you establish real control, and sometimes you just make it look like you have control. But if you're in a dangerous situation, but you're given special training, protective equipment, you follow protocols that minimize the risk, you might not have a problem assuming the risk. The company you work for goes out of their way to minimize risk. This also goes hand in hand with trust. If your company is going out of their way to minimize risk, they're probably trustworthy. There's a genuine benefit. Again, if you are assuming some risk, you need to be rewarded for that risk. And then the last is sometimes it's socially expected that you take certain risks. Sometimes that's peer pressure, sometimes it's professional identity. If you're friends with a police officer or a fireman, there is an expectation that they will assume more risk than the average person. So when it comes to what engineers do, these are the four main areas of risk we need to talk about. There's uncertainty in design, there's risk-benefit analysis, personal risk, and then public risk and public acceptance. So in when you're designing something, you never design it to be risky. You get paid, in fact, to take something that is risky and designing away the risk as best you can. Um, it's uncommon for people to pay more for something that has more risk associated with it. They usually pay less for that. Unfortunately, people don't realize that. So you either pay to design out the risk, or you pay in court in the form of loss of you pay in court, you lose customers, or you lose, your reputation. Now, these are a handful of reasons you might have risk. So the customer's requirements change. This is normal. Customers' needs change over time, and it's your job to be dynamic. No, it's not exclusively the engineer's job, but if you work for a company that makes, say you work for a company that makes tools, part of your job to make sure that you have somebody getting feedback from the customer saying, this is how I'm using the tool you're making for me. Just because you've got a written document explaining to them how they're supposed to use it does not mean they're doing that. And it's stupid to assume that that is. It's your job to make sure that they use it in a safe way. So you have to design in such a way that it gets used safely. There are special instances where there's a technology limitation. You are either pushing the limits of the material you're using, the manufacturing process you're using, or the technology you're using. This has inherent issues associated with it, but to be competitive, you have to assume these risks from time to time. There's costs and resource constraints. Sometimes you don't have time to test everything. And the last is compliance requirements. The way I interpret codes might not meet everybody else's interpretation. Some people will interpret the requirement to be a lot more relaxed than how I might interpret the regulations. And to be honest, sometimes they're right. Sometimes their relaxed interpretation is correct. However, when that happens, sometimes that forces you to change the design because you were planning on the regulation being there and now it's not. This is Anger's Bridge. This is an example of a product being used incorrectly. It was designed to allow a battalion, 1,000 men, to cross at a time. Now, this wasn't a case of overloading. 1,000 people were crossing one day. Earlier in the morning, 2 battalions had crossed. Not at the same time. One battalion went from the city and left, another battalion went from the city and left. And now it was the afternoon, the battalions are coming back. However, on this particular day, there was a rainstorm. Very windy. The bridge was actually swaying back and forth a little bit. And then a series of events that were unfortunate occurred. So these soldiers were marching. They were marching in unison, which caused a resonance to form. So when they would step, the entire bridge would shake up and down with that one step. While that was happening, there was wind blowing perpendicular to the bridge, causing the bridge to sway. A combination of that swaying and the downforce from the march caused the ropes to snap and the bridge to collapse. This is an example of changing customer requirements. This is the change in compliance requirements. So the car on the left is the Ford Pinto. It's being rear-ended by any given car. As long as the engine was on, a fireball would form. You can see towards the end of the video the fireball forming. The reason this happened is there was a fuel tank in the back. The fuel tank would crack. However, instead of the normal safety regulations, Ford went a different route. They knew that it wasn't illegal at the time to do what they were doing. So they went ahead and put the fuel tank in a spot where it could get hit and cracked. Ford's interpretation of the law said that they didn't need to change the design if the first lot of cars were sold before the new law was introduced, which was technically true. Then the law came into existence, and Ford pointed out that they were grandfathered in for everything made before the law. And they claim to have done their due diligence. They offered a market solution to this problem where it would cost about $15 to go fix. But the thing is, do you think wealthy McGee and Scrooge McDuck were driving this Ford Pinto, or do you think a poor college student was driving this Ford Pinto? It's a poor college student. And a lot of times, they weren't reading Consumer Reports every day. They weren't watching the news every day. They were unaware of this problem. And so they'd get rear-ended. The car would light on fire. Everyone would die. This is technology limitations. The new computer chips that they're making in Taiwan are 5 nanometers thick. This is not a good example of that because it clearly states it's 40 nanometers, but I couldn't get photos of those under an X-ray, but I could get these. So every commercial product that does any level of thinking requires a device like this. This can only be made by a handful of factories in Taiwan. All of the manufacturers, Samsung, Ford, Sony, Microsoft, assumed that these manufacturers would be able to supply their demands and told customers that they'd be able to produce accordingly. It wasn't true. For the most part, the chip shortage isn't as bad as it used to be. When I made this slide, it was really hard to get your hands on a PlayStation. Now it's not. However, this is a case of tech limitations. 5 nanometers is about an atom thick. The chips they were making literally were about an atom thick in certain sections. Because of this, there was a supply chain issue, and people had to find other solutions to their problems. Unfortunately, this led to fewer cars being made, fewer PlayStations being sold, fewer appliances getting made, things like that. Now, I would love to do a couple lessons just on risk-benefit analysis, but unfortunately we just don't have the time for it. Now, I've got an example here. Different places do it a little bit differently, but it's more or less the same. Maybe you change the axes that you look at. So first, you generate the chart. One axis is the benefit, and the other axis is the risk. Some places, instead of having benefit, they have severity. So instead of having benefit, it's the negative of that. But first you go through and you identify the risks. Begin by clearly defining the potential risks involved in the decision or project. This includes considering both known and potential risks that may arise from various factors such as technical, environmental, social, or regulations. Next, identify and define the potential benefits associated with the decision or project. These include positive impacts on stakeholders, financial gains, improved efficiency, enhanced safety, environmental sustainability, or any other desired outcome. Do your best to quantify the risk. Assign numerical values or scores to risks and benefits to enable a quantitative analysis. This can be done through various methods such as probability assessment, impact assessment, cost-benefit analysis, multi-criteria decision analysis. Quantifying risk and benefits helps in comparing and prioritizing different factors. So I need to be clear. It's really important that you do this with a lot of your decisions. And it might not make sense to show your boss every time you do it, but it's important to do it so that way when you come back to it in a year or two and you say, why did I make that decision? You can see all of the other factors that you've forgotten about and have justification why you moved forward the way you did. Evaluate the likelihood of each risk occurring and the potential severity of its impact. Similarly, assess the probability of achieving each benefit and the magnitude of its positive impact. This step involves gathering data, conducting research, and utilizing expert opinions or historical information. Compare and weigh the risks against the benefits to determine the relative significance. This involves considering the importance or priority of each risk and benefit, as well as the trade-off and potential conflicts between them. Evaluate the effectiveness of potential risk mitigation measures and their impact on reducing the identified risk. Assess the feasibility, costs, and potential side effects of implementing these measures. Compare different decision options or alternatives based off of their overall risk-benefit profiles. And lastly, communicate. Clearly communicate the results of the risk-benefit analysis. No, you probably don't need to tell your boss every single time you do something like this. But on big decisions, and he asks you what you think, definitely do this. You want your boss to know that you actually think. And sometimes something like this it sounds involved, but it's really not. And if you do it, your boss will at least know, hey, this person actually cares about the things that I'm telling him to do. So this is a basic engineering problem, something you probably will see. The city's infrastructure department plans to build a new bridge to enhance transportation connectivity and accommodate increasing traffic demands. As the material engineer assigned to the project, you are responsible for selecting the appropriate materials for the bridge's construction. The goal is to ensure the bridge's long-term durability, safety, and cost-effectiveness while considering the potential risks and benefits associated with various material options. So I can't do it during the recording, but I want you to stop, look at each of these options, go back to the previous slide, and I want you to give me 2 pros and 2 cons to each of these, and I want you to give a weight to each pro and each con. So actually go make that chart, and try to populate it. All right, to make an informed decision, you perform a risk-benefit analysis considering the following factors: structural performance, cost effectiveness, safety and reliability, environmental impact, project timeline, and stakeholder considerations. All right, now let's talk about personal risk. There's voluntary risk, there's hobbies, there's professions, and there's habits. People will assume voluntary risk that is 1,000 times more dangerous than involuntary risk. People will go skydiving. They'll choose to go skydiving even though it has a high death rate compared to other hobbies, and then be willing to let those people move in next to them because they look kind of dangerous. There's personal risk. There's involuntary risk. This is risk that's imposed on you by somebody else. There's environmental factors, societal conditions, actions of others. These are all things people really want to reduce. All right, now let's talk about dealing with the public. The public wants the impossible. They want to have 0% risk even though it's impossible. They want to substitute facts with opinions and beliefs even though that's dangerous. It's difficult to define what consent genuinely is. For example, when TF Green was built, there weren't very many houses near it, and the locals didn't mind that it was put there. However, as time passed, more houses were built around the airport. Does buying a house near the airport after it was built mean you're giving consent to listen to the airplanes land and take off? Or LNG import terminals. The risk is owned by the port city, and the benefit is distributed to the whole state. Therefore, the city enforces a system of taxes on all the NG that passes through the city. Is that fair? So, one big important detail when dealing with the public, you need to be transparent so that way they feel like they're experiencing free and informed consent. And you need to communicate with them. You need to talk to them. You need to explain to them what's going on so they feel involved. And when there is genuinely more risk or perceived risk, you have to provide them more reward or perceived more reward. Yeah. Okay. We're going to talk about some nuclear stuff because this is the part of the class where I actually go over case. Before I get started, I would like to make a point. I'm not big on talking about nuclear. I find nuclear energy very interesting. I feel more people should know about it, but I don't like talking about it. The reason I don't like talking about it is there's much more disinformation than objective information. And feelings run high very quickly, and it makes it impossible to have objective discussions. There's a cartoon where somebody points out that the amount of information required to argue with misinformation is inversely proportional to the amount of information that that person's willing to absorb. Okay, so I'm going to give you some background on 3 Mile Island. It was commissioned, meaning its last construction stroke occurred 2 September 1974. It was decommissioned 20 September 2019. It was a pressurized water reactor. The reactor was built by Babcock and Wilcox. That company was founded in Providence, and it experienced a partial reactor meltdown 28th of March 1979. Okay, here's a series of events. There was a water interruption. There was a valve. The valve got sticky. They went to make it not sticky by opening and closing it forcefully, rapidly within a few seconds, and then it got stuck. This in and of itself not really a problem. That can be fixed. However, this instigated the system shutdown. This was supposed to happen. This isn't really a problem yet. System shutdown activates, starts cooling everything down. The scram and the relief valve activate. Scram is the safety control rod Axeman. It is the shutdown system. Again, not really a problem. You want it to shut down. The shutdown system activated. The relief valve opened. This causes a sudden drop in pressure and sudden drop in temperature. Again, at this point, this is normal. You want these things to happen. The relief valve fails open. Not necessarily good. However, they have a backup in case that relief valve fails open. They have emergency coolant water, which will fill the reactor with water and prevent it from melting down. Unfortunately, the valve that connects to it was erroneously closed the day before. So what proceeds to happen is all of the water in that reactor tank boils away. Once the water's gone, there's nothing to cool down the reactor. So there's still plenty of ambient heat in that thing. It's still reacting a little bit and getting hotter. Eventually, the material melts. We don't actually know what's inside the reactor. We think this is what it looks like, but we're not positive. The reason we don't know what it looks like is because it's unsafe to go in there and there's no value added in knowing this piece of information. We know it melted down. We know that there is some uranium collected at the bottom. We know the core melted. Having more granular information doesn't add value to anybody. So this is the immediate response. So 1 hour after the incident, once the power plant knew there was a problem, they notified PEPA, Pennsylvania EPA, per protocol. PEPA contacted the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Pennsylvania governor, and the Pennsylvania lieutenant governor. After 16 hours, the core temperature fell enough for operators to assess the damage. After 24 hours, the lead chemist went in and measured the radiation of the room. Ed, unfortunately, started having a metallic taste in his mouth almost as soon as he walked in, which is not a good sign, and so he immediately walked out. Funny story, Ed was not allowed to go back to work because he was radioactive for about a month. After 28 hours, the plant operators recommended to the Pennsylvania governor and the lieutenant governor to evacuate the area. So, at this point, can you see anything that's inherently unethical? There is some debate over timing. It took 28 hours for them to evacuate the area. There is debate over whether the operators were adequately trained. Had the emergency relief valve shut, the operators would have known to act quicker, but they insist that the operator didn't see it because there was a blinking light. There was also frustration over the way things got communicated. I'm not going to go into that because it's kind of beyond the scope of this class, but my perception of what happened is the engineers did explain what was going on. It's the general public doesn't take what we give them the way we give it to them. And so they interpreted as best they could, and then they told the general public what they understood, which they shouldn't have done. Nowadays, when there's an issue with, say, like the DOT and the bridge, DOT itself goes to the public and says, this is what's going on. They don't tell the governor so the governor can tell the general public because too much information changes or is lost when that happens. Now, if you're at home, I want you to answer the question, how much of the problem was rooted in the fact that it was an emergency? This was one of the first big meltdowns. Do you think the operators were panicking? Do you think the plant manager was panicking? Do you think they were level-headed? Do you think as engineers, they took those jobs so that way they could have a panicky job, or do you think they took those jobs because it was easy and not stressful? All right, now we're going to talk about Chernobyl. Chernobyl's a bit more complicated. they decided to run a special type of test where they cut off mechanical power to the alternator to see how much power the alternator would make with just the remaining momentum. To get this to work correctly, they had to disconnect the emergency core cooling system. Then they removed the control rods. Then they activated extra pumps. Then there was xenon buildup. Xenon buildup activated the emergency alarms. There wasn't supposed to be xenon. Instead of respecting the alarm, they deactivated the alarm. And after the alarm was deactivated, the core heated at an exponential rate and a runaway reaction occurred. The core simply got hotter and hotter. This caused the steam pressure in the reactor to grow as well. It's known that the AZ5 button, the scram button, was pressed before detonation, but it's unclear if this caused the explosion or if the explosion would have happened anyway. This is Chernobyl. This is the reactor. If you're at home, I want a written explanation of how this image is different than the 3 Mile Island image. All right, immediate response by the Soviets. So the explosion occurred at 1:24. Local authorities in Moscow initially described the incident as a minor fire, and there was no concern. Only after 52 people were hospitalized, this is 36 hours later, they evacuated Pripyat. After 10 days, they generated an exclusion zone. They told the population of Pripyat that they'd be gone for a few days. Most of them were never allowed to go home. Soviets only acknowledged that there was a meltdown after Swedish early warning systems for nuclear explosions started to go off. So, can you see anything inherently unethical about how Chernobyl was handled? Debate exists over safety and design flaws. Now, one thing I will say, when you compare Western reactors to these RBMKs, an American nuclear reactor and a European nuclear reactor are constantly in a state of shutting down. They're actively trying to shut themselves down so that way the safety systems don't have to turn on. And it's the engineer's job to keep it going. If the engineers were to go away, most control systems at most nuclear power plants will shut them off. The RBMK was different. If the operators walked away, it would eventually become supercritical. And it was the engineer's job to try to constantly be shutting it off. So there is some debate, but the general acceptance is the RBMK was designed poorly. And it was built poorly as well. There was lack of transparency. The Soviets did not communicate. Not only did not communicate, but they even had the information knowing that they had to move people, and they didn't until it became obvious there was a problem. It's assumed that there was human error and negligence. We honestly don't know. We know that there was a test planned for that day, and we know based off of readings what happened during the test. But for the most part, the operators died. during the explosions. We just don't know.